She stood in her Levittown kitchen in 1953, timer ticking, guests arriving in 10 minutes, not knowing that Smile took years of unwritten training to master. In the years after the war, the American living room became a stage, and every homemaker was expected to know how to run the show without a script. There were no classes for this. There was only Emily Post's etiquette book on the shelf, a mother's half-remembered advice, and the quiet terror of getting it wrong in front of the neighbors. This video is about the rules nobody wrote on a card, but every good hostess carried in her bones. Emily Post published her book called Etiquette back in 1922, and by the 1950s it was still the Bible sitting on newlywed shelves across the country. It had been revised again and again, most recently in 1945 and 1955, each version quietly adjusting to a changing America. Post herself was born into an old money family in 1872 and became an etiquette authority almost by accident after a publisher asked her to simply write down what proper behavior looked like. By the 50s, Post's name had become shorthand for good manners everywhere in America. Neighbors would say of a particularly gracious woman, "She's a real Emily Post," without anyone needing to explain what that meant. That is the kind of cultural weight one book carried. It was less a guide and more a shared language, something every hostess could quietly reference even if she never opened the actual pages that week. Then in 1952 came the challenger. Amy Vanderbilt released her complete book of etiquette, and unlike Post's old money tone, Vanderbilt wrote for a different kind of woman entirely, the one in the new suburb with no household staff and no inherited fortune, just a mortgage and a dinner party to plan. It sold strongly through the decade and became a direct rival on the very same bookshelf. Vanderbilt understood something Post never had to face. The servant was gone. By the 1950s, live-in domestic help had become rare and expensive for the average suburban family, a real shift from the world Post grew up describing. The effortless hostess of magazine photographs was, in truth, a woman doing every bit of the labor herself, and Vanderbilt's book was written to help her do it without falling apart. This was the real secret behind every graceful dinner party of the era. Nothing about it was actually effortless. Etiquette writers of the period were candid that the whole evening was one woman's carefully timed solo performance, often rehearsed down to the minute days in advance. The centerpiece looked spontaneous. It was not. The timing looked natural. It had been practiced like a piece of music. And where did all this happen? Picture a brand new Cape Cod home in Levittown, New York, purchased for somewhere between $7,990 and $9,500, depending on the model and year. Levittown broke ground in 1947, and by 1951 it held roughly 17,000 houses and about 82,000 residents, each one built with a living room meant for exactly this kind of gathering. That living room was not an accident of architecture. It was the physical proof of a cultural expectation. A young couple moved in, hung their wedding photos, and understood, without anyone saying it aloud, that this room existed to host people. The parlor of their grandmother's generation had shrunk and modernized, but its purpose had not changed one bit. Now picture the clock ticking toward 5 in the afternoon. This was the cocktail hour, running roughly from 5 to 6:30, and it had become a mainstream suburban ritual by the 1950s, even though its roots traced back to Prohibition in the 1920s, when drinking moved out of public bars and into private homes out of pure necessity. What began as a workaround became, 30 years later, a codified social event with its own unspoken choreography. A good hostess did not plant herself beside one guest and stay there all night. She was taught to spend only a few minutes with each person or cluster before moving smoothly on, so that nobody in the room ever felt forgotten. It sounds almost like modern networking advice, and in a way it was exactly that, except the goal was never a business card. The goal was making every single guest feel like the guest of honor. The cocktail napkins were not scattered around carelessly either. They were sized small enough to hold with a drink in one hand, and a thoughtful hostess kept several stacks placed around the room rather than one central pile, anticipating exactly where her guests would drift throughout the evening. Small detail, real intent. Nothing about this decade's hosting was left purely to chance. And despite the image of a boozy, loose party that modern television sometimes paints, the etiquette guidance of the era was actually quite restrained about alcohol. Hostesses were advised to control the pacing, serve food alongside the drinks, and quietly watch for anyone who had clearly had enough. This was less about morality and more about protecting the whole evening from tipping into chaos. By 6:30, the cocktail hour gave way to dinner, and this is where the real architecture of the evening revealed itself. Seating was never left to chance. Etiquette manuals mandated alternating men and women around the table, and, more surprisingly to modern ears, separating married couples so spouses never sat beside each other. It was never a snub. Splitting up couples was considered genuinely good hosting, meant to force fresh conversation and keep the whole table from splintering into private, whispered pairs. A husband and wife could talk to each other any night of the week. A dinner party was the one evening designed to make them talk to everyone else instead. There was even a superstition taken seriously enough that etiquette columns addressed it directly: 13 guests at one table. Rather than risk offending a superstitious guest, the advice was simple and practical. Just invite a 14th person. No debate, no drama, just a quiet adjustment to the guest list days before anyone noticed the number at all. The table itself told its own story before a single word was spoken. A proper formal setting included a salad fork, a dinner fork, and sometimes a smaller fork reserved for fish or dessert, all governed by one simple rule: work from the outside in. This was not folklore invented later. It was a genuinely documented convention straight out of the era's etiquette manuals. But that full spread was not the everyday reality. And this is where a common misconception creeps in. Elaborate formal settings were reserved for special occasions. The typical suburban dinner party used a simplified version, and etiquette writers explicitly warned readers against over-formalizing a casual gathering. Even the Rulebook knew when to relax a little. Guests arriving that evening understood one more unspoken rule before they even rang the doorbell. A hostess gift was expected, but not just any gift would do. Amy Vanderbilt's guidance was specific: a small box of chocolates, flowers already arranged in their own vase, or a bottle of good sherry. Notice what was missing from that list. Nothing that required the hostess to do anything with it that night. Never unarranged flowers needing a vase found at the last minute. Never a dish she was suddenly expected to serve alongside her own carefully planned menu. That was considered presumptuous, adding a burden to a woman who had already spent days preparing. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works. Modern etiquette has drifted far from this rule, and most guests today unknowingly break it, showing up with a bottle that needs opening or flowers that need a home found fast. Your grandmother's generation understood a truth we forgot: that a real gift never asks anything of the person receiving it. Now imagine something goes wrong in the kitchen, because something always did. A dish burns, a tray slips, the timing falls apart behind the swinging door. Etiquette manuals of the period were explicit on this point. A hostess never apologized for her food, her house, or any mishap in front of her guests. Drawing attention to an error was considered worse than the error itself. So the burnt edge got quietly trimmed away in the kitchen, the drop tray got cleaned up without comment, and the hostess walked back into the room with the exact same composed smile she left with. Guests rarely knew anything had gone wrong at all, and that silence was the entire point. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save. Most of these rules were never printed on the invitation or explained out loud. They lived in the muscle memory of women who learned them from their mothers, tested them at their own first dinner parties, and passed them along the same quiet way they had received them. One especially clever strategy came straight out of the entertaining guides of the decade: And it was not just a quirky habit. A hostess was encouraged to develop a signature dish, one recipe she became known for and served at nearly every gathering. This was a deliberate move to reduce her own stress and build a reputation guests came to expect and trust. The signature dish meant fewer decisions on the day of the party, fewer variables that could go wrong, and a menu she had already perfected through repetition. Guests came expecting it and were rarely disappointed because she had quietly turned one recipe into a kind of personal trademark, something no cookbook could have handed her. Speaking of recipe cards, the Betty Crocker Picture Cookbook arrived in 1950, becoming a staple wedding gift that sat right alongside the etiquette manuals on the shelf. Later, the Betty Crocker Cookie Book followed in 1963, and together these titles sold somewhere between roughly 1.4 and 3 million copies across their early printings. Between the etiquette manual and the cookbook, a new homemaker had almost everything she needed to become a confident hostess without ever attending a single class. One book told her how to behave. The other told her what to serve. Together, they quietly built the entire framework of post-war entertaining, one household at a time. Television played its own quiet role in shaping the expectation. Shows like Father Knows Best, which ran from 1954 to 1960, put the suburban home on display as a stage for orderly domestic performance. The character Margaret Anderson became a fictional model of hostess behavior that millions of women watched weekly, whether or not they ever noticed how closely it mirrored the etiquette books. Leave It to Beaver followed in 1957 and ran through 1963, reinforcing the same picture of a tidy, well-hosted, orderly household. These were not etiquette instruction manuals dressed up as entertainment. They were a cultural mirror, reflecting back the exact norms the manuals were already codifying, so the message reached women twice, once in print and once on the screen. Not every gathering in this decade was a formal dinner party either. Every week, somewhere in the neighborhood, a rotating group of women gathered for a bridge club, hosted on a schedule that moved from house to house. The current hostess prepared refreshments and set a card table, and the role simply passed along to the next woman on the calendar. This was an extremely common social institution, documented often in the pages of women's magazines like Ladies' Home Journal, McCall's, and Good Housekeeping, which ran etiquette columns specifically about bridge party hosting duties. It was smaller than a dinner party, less formal, but it followed exactly the same underlying logic. Do not embarrass anyone, keep everything moving, and never let the seams show. Before any of this social choreography even had a chance to happen, there was an older custom quietly fading in the background. Formal calling cards, engraved cards a visitor would leave behind when paying a social call, had been a Victorian and Edwardian tradition that was already dying out by the 1950s. Here is a misconception worth correcting directly. The calling card tradition did not carry straight into the 1950s unchanged. The strict Victorian ritual, complete with turned-down corners carrying specific coded meanings, had mostly disappeared. What survived was a much simpler descendant, living on in place cards, printed invitations, and thank you notes. Even faded, the calling card's DNA survived in a real and documented practice. Many hostesses kept a card file tracking each guest's preferences and prior conversations, a small personal archive that let her remember exactly what a guest liked to drink or what topic had sparked laughter the last time they visited. That card file was, in its own quiet way, an early form of hospitality intelligence, decades before anyone would have used that phrase. A hostess who remembered that a guest preferred sherry over gin or that his wife loved talking about gardening made every single person at her table feel personally known. That was never an accident. It was a system. The evening was not over once dessert plates were cleared. There was one final unspoken obligation waiting on the other end, and it belonged to the guest this time, not the hostess. A thank you note was expected within about a week of any dinner party attended. Failing to send one was not a minor slip. It was treated as a real social infraction, serious enough that it could quietly affect whether that guest received a future invitation at all. Manners were not decoration in this world. They were currency, and a missed thank you note spent trust the guest might not get back. Step back for a moment and consider what all of this actually adds up to. It is easy to look at seating charts and card files and assume this was all about class snobbery or showing off wealth, but that misses the real engine underneath it. Much of this codified etiquette existed to make guests comfortable and take pressure off and increasingly help less self-reliant homemaker. This was practical hosting psychology dressed up as tradition. The never apologize rule protected her dignity. The seating chart protected the flow of conversation. The hostess gift rule protected her from extra last-minute labor. Every single unspoken rule, examined closely, was solving a real problem for a woman who was doing all of this completely alone. The ritual was never written down, but every good hostess knew it by heart. That is the phrase that keeps surfacing when you dig into this history, because so little of it exists as a formal checklist anywhere. It was absorbed the way a language is absorbed, through years of watching, hosting, failing quietly, and trying again the next month. Consider the sheer coordination required for a single evening. The menu had to be planned around what could be made ahead versus what needed last-minute attention. The seating chart had to balance personalities as carefully as it balanced genders. The drink cart had to be stocked before the first doorbell rang. None of this happened by instinct alone, and she did all of this while raising children, running a household budget, and often managing her own social calendar for multiple gatherings a month. The image of the effortless 50s hostess, hair perfectly set and apron never wrinkled, was a performance built on hours of invisible labor that history rarely credits properly. Your grandmother knew how to make a room feel like home, and it is worth asking honestly what changed. Part of the answer is simple economics and freedom. More women working outside the home by the 1960s, smaller households, fewer hours available for a multi-course seated dinner party planned days in advance. By the 1960s, both Post's and Vanderbilt's successors were already updating their guidance to reflect this shift, writing for working women and smaller households without domestic help of any kind. The rules did not vanish overnight. They loosened gradually, decade by decade, as the world that had produced them kept changing underneath them. By the 1970s and 1980s, etiquette writing had shifted its entire tone, moving away from prescriptive ritual toward what publishers started calling flexible good manners. The highly codified 50s rulebook, once treated as near gospel in every household, had become something else entirely, a nostalgia object rather than an active daily practice. And by the time the formal multi-course seated dinner party had faded from mainstream frequency, something else had quietly replaced it in most American homes. Takeout containers eaten in front of a television, the very object that once broadcast the dinner party ideal, now simply broadcasting to an empty room where no one hosted anyone at all. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works, and that is really the argument at the heart of this whole video. None of these unspoken rules require a Levittown mortgage or a closet full of formal china to bring back. They require intention, the same intention a young hostess brought to her very first cocktail hour in 1953. Take the seating rule as one small example anyone could try tonight. Simply thinking about who sits beside whom, rather than letting guests fall into their usual pairs, can change the entire texture of an evening's conversation. It costs nothing. It requires no china pattern or engraved invitation. It only requires the same care a 1950s hostess brought to her table chart. Or take the hostess gift rule, arguably the most quietly useful one of the entire decade. A gift that requires no action from the person receiving it, already arranged flowers, rather than a bundle needing a vase, is a small act of genuine consideration that modern etiquette simply forgot to keep teaching. Now let us return to the etiquette manuals themselves for a moment, because they were more nuanced than modern retellings sometimes suggest. Neither Post nor Vanderbilt wrote rigid, humorless rulebooks that meant perfection at every turn. Both women repeatedly emphasized putting the guest at ease above any technical correctness, a detail often lost when people flatten this era into pure formality. In fact, both books contained direct guidance not to over-formalize casual gatherings, a detail that surprises viewers who assume every 50s evening looked like a state dinner. The truth is more layered and more human. There was a formal register for special occasions and a relaxed one for an ordinary Tuesday, and knowing which one to use was itself part of the unwritten skill. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and that includes the physical objects themselves. A card file box, a set of cocktail napkins printed with a hostess's initials, a molded gelatin mold that once anchored a signature dish. These are the kinds of artifacts sitting quietly in attics and estate sales, waiting for someone to recognize what they represent. Consider the dollar figures again for a moment, because they tell their own story about accessibility. A Levittown home at $7,000 to $9,500 was not a mansion. It was a modest, mass-produced starter home. And yet the living room inside it still carried the full weight of formal hosting expectations. Grand entertaining had trickled down to ordinary households. That trickle-down mattered enormously to the culture of hosting. Formal entertaining was no longer confined to families with generational wealth. It had become a shared, middle-class aspiration, something a young couple with a new mortgage and a new baby could still pursue, one carefully rehearsed dinner party at a time, with a $5 budget and a borrowed recipe. Now picture the Bridge Club hostess again for a moment, because her burden was smaller but no less real. She was expected to bake something worth talking about, keep the coffee refreshed without hovering, and manage a table of card players who might be there for 3 or 4 hours at a stretch, all while appearing entirely unhurried the whole time. This rotating hosting duty also built something more valuable than any single party: a genuine neighborhood network of trust. Each woman took her turn. Each woman was, in turn, a guest at someone else's table the following month, and the whole arrangement quietly reinforced community bonds that modern suburban life, spread thin across cars and calendars, rarely manages to replicate today. The parlor remembers, even when we forget. That phrase captures something real about why this history keeps resurfacing in unexpected places: in estate sale finds, in a grandmother's recipe socks, in a faded photograph of a table set for 8. The room itself outlasted the ritual, and the objects inside it are still trying to tell us what it once knew. It is worth pausing on why this specific subject keeps finding new audiences right now. There is a well-documented, ongoing wave of vintage homemaking and etiquette revival content spreading across platforms in recent years, drawing people back toward the aesthetics and rituals of an earlier decade with real curiosity rather than pure irony. Part of that pull is not really about the 50s at all. It is about a documented decline in Americans hosting or attending dinner parties compared to mid-century norms, and a broader cultural conversation about loneliness and disconnection that has surfaced repeatedly in recent years, including formal commentary on the subject from U.S. public health officials in 2023. That is really the quiet argument underneath all this nostalgia. People are not just admiring the tablecloths and the cocktail glasses for their own sake. They are recognizing, maybe without fully naming it, that a structured evening built around intentional hosting solved a problem we are only now rediscovering we still have. Think back once more to that Levittown kitchen at the very start of this video, timer ticking, 10 minutes on the clock. Every rule we have walked through, the seating chart, the hostess gift, the never apologize instinct, the signature dish was already loaded into her, whether she had studied it consciously or simply absorbed it from watching her own mother do the same thing years earlier. None of it was written on a card taped inside her cupboard. It lived somewhere quieter than that, in the timing of her hands, in the calm on her face when the doorbell finally rang, in a whole decade's worth of unspoken agreement about what it meant to make someone feel genuinely welcome in your home. Consider, too, how much of this required simply paying attention to other people, something that can feel almost radical to describe now, watching for the guest who had one drink too many, noticing which conversation cluster had gone quiet and needed a gentle nudge, remembering which guest preferred sherry from a card file kept just for that purpose. None of these unspoken rules asked a hostess to be wealthy or extravagant. They asked her to be observant, prepared, and generous with her attention in a room full of people who trusted her to hold the evening together. That is a skill set, not a class marker, and it is exactly why it still translates so well to any living room today. It is easy, looking back from where we sit now, to romanticize the whole decade into a golden age of gracious living, and just as easy to dismiss it entirely as a rigid, exhausting performance forced on women with few other choices. The honest answer sits somewhere between those two extremes, and that is exactly where this history deserves to stay. These women were not simply following orders from a book. They were solving a genuinely difficult problem: how to build community and connection with almost no institutional support, no live-in help, and enormous social pressure to make it all look effortless. And they solved it with real skill worth taking seriously today. There is real grief buried in how much of this got lost, not because the specific fork order or the exact seating chart matters on its own, but because the underlying habit of intentional, structured hosting quietly disappeared along with it, replaced by convenience and a screen glowing in an otherwise empty room. And yet none of it is gone for good. Every rule we have covered today, working the room with real attention, sending a genuine thank you note, choosing a hostess gift that asks nothing in return, thinking carefully about who sits beside whom, is entirely available to anyone willing to bring the same intention a young hostess once brought to her very first dinner party. So the next time you set a table, even a simple one for 2 or 3 people, you might think about the seating, the small gift that asks nothing back, the quiet composure when something inevitably goes a little wrong in the kitchen. These are not relics. They are tools, tested for decades, still waiting to be picked back up. We have covered nearly every corner of this world tonight. The etiquette books, the Levittown living rooms, the cocktail hour choreography, the bridge clubs, the card files, and underneath every single one of them, the same simple truth kept surfacing again and again. A great hostess was never performing perfection. She was performing care. When you strip away the specific forks and the specific superstitions, what remains is a set of instincts about making other people feel welcome, remembered, and comfortable in your home, and those instincts do not belong only to 1953. They belong to anyone willing to slow down long enough to practice them again. There is something quietly moving about spending this much time with a stranger's kitchen timer, a stranger's guest list, a stranger's carefully folded napkin, and realizing how much thought and love was poured into evenings that left almost no written record behind, just a warm memory in the people who were there. Your grandmother knew how to make a room feel like home, and maybe that is the whole point of gathering this history back up piece by piece, not to recreate every single rule exactly as it was, but to remember that hosting was once treated as a real craft worth taking seriously, and to let that seriousness inspire us again. If any part of this history struck a chord with you, tell me which unspoken rule surprised you the most in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing which small detail from a vanished world made you want to try it yourself. Subscribe if you want more of these stories pulled straight out of the forgotten parlor, and I will see you in the next one.